Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 5 game from the World Open. Now, if you followed the round 4 video, you know that I lost a relatively quick game against Grandmaster Vettese Durabali, and it was actually very disappointing because I'd done this work to, actually get up and play a strong player, and then to not really show any kind of tenacity or challenge him at all was kind of a disappointing result. So I was hoping to recover in this one in round 5 now that I'd be playing down again. My opponent in this one was a young FIDE master by the name of Vettese, a young player from Canada. And what do you know, the second young player I played from Canada, because I played someone in the first round that was from Canada. And so individual by the name of, I think it was Max Chen, I believe. So yeah, kind of a funny thing playing 2 young Canadian juniors, but I suppose Canada's not too far from Philadelphia where the tournament was played. Anyways, I was white in this one, and I was hoping to kind of, press my opponent a little bit. So without further ado, let's get into it. So I went with d4, and Nicholas went for knight f6, and I went knight f3. If you've followed videos on this channel, you've seen the d4 knight f3 move order employed quite a bit. And yeah, I just decided to just keep it, consistent, keep it relatively flexible. And here, Nicholas went for g6. And, whenever someone plays g6, you're not too sure if it's going to be a King's Indian with d6 or it's going to be a Grunfeld with d5. And that's essentially the quintessential question when they go g6 is what, Indian defense are they going to play, Grunfeld or King's Indian? So I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about my responses to them. I have played the London system quite a bit over the course of the year. I've also played c4 a bit, going for main lines. But I just didn't want to really challenge my opponent in the main lines, considering that I'm always a little bit wary of young players knowing a lot of theory. And so I kind of wanted to get in a position where I can just show my strength and kind of outplay them. And so I went for the move e3, which is extremely harmless, but kind of just, is a little bit unassuming and, just kind of gets a position on the board. After e3, bishop g7 was played. And again, now I still don't know whether it's a Grunfeld or King's Indian, d6 or d5, but I was soon to find out. And I went bishop b2. And now black played c5, and this kind of informed to me that Nicholas was not necessarily willing to go for a Grunfeld type of structure and was probably a King's Indian player. Because if you're a King's Indian player, you're typically going to play on the dark squares with d6 and maybe c5 or e5. And c5 is a kind of dark square plan. So given the fact that he went c5, I thought, okay, he's probably a King's Indian player, but I wasn't completely sure. And c5 is an interesting move because it challenges the d4 pawn right away. And it pretty much invites lines that I actually had earlier this year against Brandon Jacobson. Because in one of my tournaments in Charlotte, he played an early c5 against this kind of reverse Queen's Gambit decline setup. And I actually took on c5 and played basically a reverse Catalan type of setup. But here I decided instead to keep the tension, and I went for castles. After castles, now taking on c5 is a little bit more of a legitimate threat because black can't recover the pawn as easily with queen a5 because it doesn't come with check. So for instance, if you castle right now, I can take on c5, and if queen a5 is played, I actually just have the move queen d4, reinforcing the pawn on c5. And there's no really efficient way to get a secondary attacker on the c5 pawn. Note that if you play knight f6, I can play bishop takes a6. And if you play any discovery move with the knight, most of the squares my queen actually controls. So the only one where you actually kind of secure and you challenge my queen is actually knight e8. But from e8, I can either step up to d5 or maybe even step to the side to c4. And again, I don't believe, white has any real problems in these positions. So actually, I decided to keep the tension just because now taking on c5 is actually a more legitimate threat. So after castles, black actually went c takes d4. And this was a little bit of a surprise to me, but it is playable. And after e takes d4 and d5, we actually have a reverse, it's actually kind of transposed to a Caro-Kann exchange variation. The reason I say that is, let me back up and show you a sample line here. So if you go e4 right away, c6, not knight c6, c6, d4, d5, takes, bishop d3, knight f6, c3, and g6. This is actually a line of the exchange Caro-Kann, where after knight f3, bishop g7, white essentially has a little bit more space in the center of the board and a more compact structure here. But black has more kingside pawns, so he's a kingside pawn majority and potentially can execute a very annoying minority attack against my chain. And so white actually says that, he has a little bit more space on the king side. These bishops are both pointing that way, and he might have some good play in the short term. But in the long term, black may have the slow, traditional trumps playing against the queen side. And so, actually, this is from an e4 opening, but you could see the way that we got to the position, we actually transpose via d4 opening. And what's the critical difference? Well, the critical difference is that my bishop is now on e2 instead of d3. And on e2, it's a little less active. It's a little more passive on e2. And so, the difference is maybe black has actually secured a more playable version, a more comfortable version of the exchange Caro-Kann with this fianchetto. Now, the flip side of that is maybe the bishop on e2 can be slightly useful, because on d3, normally black just tries to exchange it with bishop f5 right away. And so the idea of actually having the bishop on e2 and not allowing black that exchange mechanism might change the dynamics a little bit. So after d5 now, I went for c3, and we basically have the same structure I've been talking about. The only difference is the bishop is on e2 instead of d3. Again, let's say the bishop was on d3, and just for argument's sake, let's say castles, bishop d3, and then bishop f5 was played. This tension is actually quite annoying for white, and it may seem that after bishop takes f5, g takes f5, black's pawn structure is ruined, but it actually is a quite compact structure with the move e6. And here it reinforces the d5 pawn and the f5 pawn, and yeah, it's pretty much a very playable position for black, so it's not a huge deal. And so, actually, the exchange of the light square bishop is not super desirable, because now white has kind of lost some artillery, or potential artillery, against the king side. So, yeah, instead, maybe there's some differences with the bishop on e2, and maybe it's somewhat advantageous, and I was about to find out. So after c3, black played knight c6, normal developing move. You could also castle, but it doesn't make a huge difference. And after knight c6, I went bishop f4, and this is kind of the nice thing about the exchange variation, is typically, if you think about this pawn structure, it's pretty much a Carlsbad structure reversed. Now, the Carlsbad is a structure that you can get from the Queen's Gambit exchange variations, and here, white is basically playing that structure like what normally the black player in the Queen's Gambit exchange variation has a structure, and white is basically playing it a tempo up. And the difference in these structures is that both of the bishops that white has actually get kind of active. Typically in these lines, the bishop actually is on c1 for a long time. But now with the bishop coming to f4, it has a really nice diagonal to exert pressure and really restrict black from expanding in the center. So after bishop f4, black went for knight e4. And I went knight d2, trying to just exchange this e4 knight. And we exchanged twice, and then castles. And this is actually the first critical position of the game, because you have a scenario where white definitely has a little bit more space, but the question is how to proceed here. And there are many interesting plans. White could play relatively modestly and maybe play rook e1 and bishop f1 and kind of play down the e-file. Another way white could play is to try to expand on the queen side with a4 and to take more space on this side of the board, kind of preempting black's potential minority attack. Another way white can play is to sometimes actually play h4, h5 and kind of shove the h-pawn off the board and create a weakness in the black camp. So there are many different ways you can play this position, and it's, very, very interesting and dynamic. And I decided to play rook e1 because I thought it was the most flexible. The idea is that I thought the rook can essentially play on the e file eventually, and I thought it was nice that it was a little bit unassuming. It did not say exactly what I was trying to do just yet, and just trying to get the rook on the half-open file, which is typically a good thing to do. After rook e1, black went for rook e8. And rook e8 kind of gears up for e5 in certain positions. And I think I was kind of alert and attuned to that. And that's why I played my next move. But I think I was a little bit, I think I was reacting a little bit too much to e5 being a potential idea. Because e5 is not actually an attractive move for black. If you play e5, right now, let's say I play a move like h3. After e5, I take a bunch of times and essentially get to play against an isolated pawn on d5 that's incredibly weak. And here white would have a, slight but nagging advantage based upon the dark squares that are weakened around the black camp. So really, e5 is not the end of the world for me, and as a consequence, I shouldn't have been so attuned to kind of stopping it, because it was something that wasn't going to hassle me very much. Because of my reluctance to allow this e5 move, I actually played the move knight e5. And knight e5 actually is it's actually a classic case of, occupying the square is not actually as valuable as controlling it. Because from f3, I was doing a great job of eyeing the square on e5, and my bishop was doing the same. And there was no problems elsewhere. Like, I could just occupy the square. e5 is not going to be played. But when I actually occupy the square, my knight actually becomes a target for the black pawn on f7. And, of course, I don't really want to take on c6 because I strengthen black's structure. So knight e5 was actually pretty ill-advised because it invited the move f6. And now the issue is by playing f6, I've accelerated black's opportunity to play e5, where he doesn't actually have to recapture with a piece. He can recapture with a pawn and actually have a nice pawn duo. So actually, knight e5 was, in some respects, a mistake. And it's kind of funny because h3 would have been a much better move. If h3 is played, after f6, I could just play rook a d1 and kind of over-centralize and deal with the e5 break. Now, if e5 is played, I could take on e5, and after fe5, play bishop g5. And you could see here that the pressure on the queen, coupled with my pressure on the d5 pawn, means that black's center is actually collapsing. So that dynamic was kind of at play, and I kind of just should have, totally centralized and not really worried about the e5 break. Instead, when I played knight e5 and f6, now e5 is actually a legitimate threat if I move my knight back. Ironically, knight f3 actually turns out to be the best move, and I think that's in part because if e5 is played, I probably can just take and then either go bishop g5 or even dart back to g3, and these pawns are centralized, but they're potential targets. So, yeah, I think even here, this would be my best chance to get pressure on these pawns. Instead, I actually took on c6, and this is a poor move because now after b takes c6, the d5 pawn is strengthened, and it's actually very hard to get pressure on the center, and black is actually just pushing for e5. Excuse me, my arrows are really bad right now. But black is pushing for e5. And that's actually the huge problem is once black gets the center, it's kind of unassailable and it's difficult to undermine. So after b takes c6, I actually went c4, doing my best to kind of loosen the structure before black played e5. But it's actually very, very difficult to accomplish this. And black actually wound up playing e5 anyway, just saying that, look, you could take on e5 a few times, but, you're just strengthening my center. I have this bishop that will open up on the diagonal, and it's just a nice little position for black. I took on e5. I played d takes e5, and this is actually another mistake. Instead, it would have been a little more sensible to just keep the tension on g3. And the big reason is that that's the case is actually this bishop on g7 is not activated as long as there's a pawn on f6. So basically, black doesn't really want to take on d4 because if I take now, the d5 pawn is isolated and weak. And if you actually push f5 instead of taking on d4, now I actually can take on e5, and after the exchange of dark square bishops, the dark squares are actually weak around black's camp. So I actually have a scenario where by keeping the tension, black can't actually advance the pawns very effectively, and it gives me the opportunity to build up more pressure on white center by getting my rooks to these open files. Instead, releasing the tension activates the bishop on g7, and believe it or not, makes the center more difficult to undermine. And so it's a classic case of where keeping the tension is actually quite valuable. After the move f takes e5, I went bishop g5 now, trying to hassle the queen here. But after queen d7, it's very, very difficult to get more pressure on these pawns. Note that if I play a move like bishop f3, e4 comes, just kicking my bishop away. And now this bishop on g7 is very, very uncomfortably eyeing my b2 pawn and the queen side in general. And even the rook coming to b8 can, be somewhat of an influence on the half-open b file. So, black is starting to take over the initiative. After queen d7, I actually played c takes d5, thinking that, I could hopefully undermine the center more if the c file was open. And after c takes d5, I actually went rook a d1, trying to pry open the middle like this. But you could see I could have had a similar version of this position if I was not so keen on actually occupying the squares in the center with my pieces and accelerating exchanges, releasing tension that enabled black to kind of get his play going. So really, this was not well executed at all, and black has a much, much easier game here. Black now just played d4, pushing the pawns, and it's actually quite sensible because these pawns, again, are very, very difficult to challenge. I played bishop h6 now, trying to actually just get rid of these dark square bishops, because I thought that if I removed a defender near the black king, I would probably be able to accelerate some pressure on the king side. But now Nicholas actually just played bishop f6, stepping away from that trade, and it's very, very difficult now to kind of, do anything, because if I play bishop g5, I thought he just goes back, and I wasn't really in the mood for a draw in a position like this, because I'm 300 points higher rated, and I'm trying to win because I'm playing down. So because of that, I didn't actually go for the repetition, even though that might have been the most sensible thing to do. Instead, I went for the move queen b4, and the idea here was maybe to try and wheel around and maybe wreak some havoc on the white king on this diagonal, or excuse me, the black king, but also to kind of make some of these squares on the queen side a little bit sensitive. I thought maybe by darting my queen around, I might get some counterplay. After queen b4, black played queen f7, and this is actually quite an effective move because the other idea I had with queen b4 was that I just threatened bishop b5, so I'm skewering the queen on d7 and the rook on e8, and I'm also stopping the rook on b8 from coming to that square. So the queen is actually doing a somewhat active job here, and with queen f7, black is actually trying to develop his last piece to e6 while also getting out of any potential uncomfortable skewers. Note that now I played bishop f3, but if I play bishop c4, that's actually well met by bishop e6. And again, these exchanges actually help black because these passed pawns in the center become stronger and stronger the more pieces come off the board. So after queen f7, I went bishop f3, trying to challenge this rook on a8. But unfortunately, this is not necessarily the best plan because it kind of forces black's hand. The only move here to save this rook is actually just a very good one. It's the move a5. And the idea is here you undermine my queen and you give a7 and a6 for your rook, allowing it to activate and be relatively active. And then once this rook gets into the game, all of black's pieces are effectively mobilized. And my rooks, again, are really not doing a great job because they can't they can't actually capture the pawns, and I can't undermine the structure with any of my pawns. My A and B pawns are too far away to challenge d4. And my f2 pawn, if I push that one, I thought I would weaken my king too much. So the issue here is my rooks are actually not particularly active because they're kind of biting on granite with black's central pawns. After a5, I went queen b6, trying to at least take away the a7 and a6 squares from the rook. Because note, if you play a move like rook a7 now, I actually have this tactic bishop d5. And the point is the queen is actually overloaded because you can't, allow the skewer, but you're also tied to the rook on a7. So after captures, I actually am up in exchange. But even here, the positions can be a little bit dangerous because black has bishop b7, and I'm obliged to go f3 because of this mating threat. So even here, it's not totally clear, but at least white has won an exchange here and presumably should be a little bit better. So that was my idea with queen b6. Instead, after queen b6, black played rook a6. And believe it or not, this was actually a move I missed, embarrassingly enough. Point is that the bishop on c8 is actually just covering the rook here. And for some reason, I had this crazy chess blindness because I actually think I missed the fact that the rook can actually go to a6. And I thought that I was actually winning an exchange here. So just a total oversight on my part. And kind of just an acknowledgement that I wasn't in good chess shape at this moment. And it's a little bit of foreshadowing, but I will discuss, how I was physically at the end of this game, and it was not pretty. After queen b6, rook a6 was played, right? And I went queen b5, stepping back, and also renewing the threat of bishop d5. Because now if bishop d5, let's say black goes for a move like a4 that doesn't do anything. After bishop d5, I'm skewering the queen and king again. And if you try to block now with bishop e6, you can see the rook on a6 is actually hanging, so I pick up an exchange. So again, I'm kind of reinforcing this threat of bishop d5. But after queen b5, black played rook d6, and this is actually quite a decent move, just stopping bishop d5 and centralizing the rook on d6. Now, it's kind of radical, too, because you're actually jettisoning the a5 pawn, but it's actually kind of funny because this a pawn does not matter as much as these central pawns. And if these pawns get rolling, I'm going to be in huge trouble. The other issue here is that I'm lacking a certain coordination in my pieces. My rooks are eyeing these pawns, but like I mentioned before, they're just not really putting, proper pressure anywhere else, and I can't actually get at the pawns, and so it's a problem because they're not really doing anything. And then my bishop on f3 is, hitting a diagonal, but it's kind of an empty diagonal and not really, particularly critical. And then the other issue is my bishop on h6 was doing something effective before, challenging this bishop on g7, trying to trade. But right now, it's kind of like a renegade piece. And so I have all these pieces that aren't actually working together, and that actually affects the dynamics of the position. After rook d6, I actually did take that pawn, but this was actually a mistake, believe it or not, and I actually needed to hunt out activity instead of material. And because of that, rook c1 would have been much better. The threat is actually rook c7, and the point is that, again, the queen would actually be overloaded because if you took on c7, my queen would take on e8 with checkmate to follow. So the point is, let's say bishop f5, now rook c7, and I'm creating a little bit of a distraction here that prevents black from pushing his pawns, but also causes a crisis in his position. So this would have been the way to play and get proper counterplay. Instead, after queen takes a5, black actually went bishop f5 and is totally centralized here. And just the pressure on my position now is tremendous because even though I have two connected passed pawns, these pawns aren't really going anywhere and the action is in the middle of the board. And you could see how my forces are scattered where black's forces are perfectly concentrated. Already e4 is actually a threat. Just pushing my bishop back and shoving these pawns up the board is a huge problem. It actually reminded me of some positions in the Kalashnikov which is a line of the Sicilian. Actually, would strongly recommend if you want to see a model game in the Kalashnikov. Beautiful game, actually, played between Vishy Anand with white and Timur Rajabov with black. Rajabov won a beautiful game, like an all-timer type of game in the Kalashnikov. And it was a situation like this where white actually had two connected pass pawns on the queen side, but really never managed to push them because the attack happening in the center was too significant. So anyways, after bishop f5, I actually went bishop e4, trying to kind of hold up this e4 break and the centralized pawns, trying to blockade on the light squares. But believe it or not, this move is actually the losing mistake. Instead, rook c1 would have been better. And again, the idea is actually to play rook c7 and hassle the queen. But the other idea is that if d3 is played now, actually threatening d2 in some lines and just pushing these pawns, I actually would now retreat with bishop d2 and just try to establish a blockade on the dark squares. And after e4, I'd actually go bishop d1. And here the position is not better for white. I don't believe that. I mean, the b2 pawn is already hanging, so bishop takes b2 at the very least is playable. These pawns are also still super, super dangerous because they're so far advanced. But at least I've held up black's initiative for the moment, and I might be able to save this game. Instead, the issue is that after bishop e4, these bishops just get traded, and it does appear that I've successfully blockaded these pawns. But the issue is my forces are completely scattered. And when your forces are scattered and you're not, very centralized, typically tactics and unfortunate things start to happen. And here, amazingly, the move g5 is just completely winning. And the issue here is that my bishop on h6 is just caught out. It's basically caught in the cookie jar and is essentially trapped. Queen g6 is a major threat, hitting the bishop on h6, but also the rook on e4 that is also unprotected. And you could just see here, all my pieces are unprotected and sensitive, and tactics just tend to happen when that is the case. So I wasn't hugely surprised that there were some tactics in this position, but it was extremely disappointing that he saw them, and it was a major cold shower because I'm basically the serious rating favorite in this game and just getting outplayed. After g5, I recognized that my bishop pretty much could not be saved, and I tried a desperado move, rook de1. And my idea with rook de1 was that I figured that the queen would try to chase the bishop, but I wanted to get as much pressure on e5 as possible before I lost that bishop on h6. So my idea was that after queen h5, which was actually played, I played the move f4. And my idea was I was hoping to kind of radically liberate the bishop on h6. Note that if g takes f4, I can actually play bishop takes f4, and e takes f4 is impossible because the rook on e8 is hanging because of my rooks are doubled, and I'm just, picking up that rook on e8. And so it would appear that f4 does create enough confusion in the position where, this bishop maybe can't get recovered right away. Because the other challenge for black is I was also trying to play f takes e5, skewering the rook and the bishop. But after f4, black actually played bishop d8, and this was just another move I completely missed. My queen is now hit with tempo, and now black has actually gotten out of the skewer that would happen potentially with, f takes e5 and hitting the d6 rook and the bishop on f6. But the other issue now is that this rook now can recapture an h6, and not only does it recapture that bishop, it also swings around and threatens nasty mating ideas around my king. So my attempt to get the bishop back with some interest, or actually to get something for it, is actually totally foiled by this bishop d8 move. And it's again a one-move threat I completely missed. So just a huge, huge problem for me. After bishop d8, I went queen b5, stepping out of the way, trying to save my queen. But now after rook takes h6, I've lost the bishop for nothing. And this mating attack on h2 is too dangerous. I now went h3 just to cover that square, but the position is totally lost, and I'm just down a piece, and yeah, it's actually quite unfortunate. I was hoping that I might get some counterplay on e5, and maybe the fact that the g-pawn was very far advanced would mean that the king would be very vulnerable to checks. But I think, Black's technique was actually quite decent. He started with the move bishop c7, which I think is very, very intelligent, because you basically make it so that I recapture on e5 with the pawn instead of my rook. And the issue here is when I recapture with my pawn, my rooks don't have an open file to operate on. So very intelligent to kind of force that capture that way. Note that I can't go queen c4 trying to pick up the bishop with check, because queen f7 would just block and invite trades that I can't really tolerate. So I actually played f takes e5. But again, here, my rooks now are not active because the pawn is in the way, and I really would have wanted to take with the rook. After f takes e5, Black now played rook e6, and I think that's another really smart move, because you hold up my e5 pawn and you make it a target, but you make sure that these rooks don't get active. Note that if rook takes d4 is played, bishop b6 would just pick up an exchange, and then I'd actually be a full rook down, and that would be totally lost. So I can't recover the pawn on d4. And that's actually really important, because if the pawn on d4 was gone, let's pretend that, like, after rook takes d4, king h8 was played for some reason. Now after rook e4, this position is actually not very easy to win, because Black actually has the wrong colored square for his rook's pawn, and so if all the pieces were off the board and Black just had a dark square bishop in the h pawn, that would actually just be a draw, because my king could hide in the corner. So given the fact that it's the wrong colored h pawn, the wrong colored rook's pawn, and he really only has two pawns, the pawn that was on d4 and the pawn on g5. He really needs to be smart about maintaining those pawns, and rook e6 does just that. So very, very good move. After rook e6, I went king h1, trying to just step out the way and try to recapture this d-pawn. But now Black played queen f7, and the issue here is that I might very well recover the pawn, but Black manages to get a very good initiative on the dark squares and can take on e5. So for instance, if I go, I actually went a4, but if I go rook takes d4, after rook takes e5, you're forcing a trade of rooks because my queen is attacked. And after rook e5, there's actually just a huge problem, because rook e1 is actually mate, because the bishop is actually covering the h2 square. And the issue is that my queen can't actually hold f1 together and e1. So if my queen moves and I hold e1, then queen f1 is actually mate in a few, because after king h2, there's just rook e2 check, and the bishop is uncovered, and I would have to block, and then mate is impending. So essentially, there's a scenario where I can't actually take the d4 pawn, and Black gets closer to kind of coordinating his pieces away from my king side and toward the center. And this means the position is just completely winning. So with every move that he makes, I kind of am running out of counterplay. So I tried my next best chance playing on the queen side with the move a4, but now Black just played rook d8. And the issue here is that this d-pawn is now totally secure and becomes a factor. And if the d-pawn becomes a distraction, then the e5 pawn becomes more of a target. And if the e5 pawn comes off the board, there will be a checkmating battery that happens almost immediately. So I'm just in a tough spot either way you slice it. I now went rook f1, challenging the queen on f7. And after queen e7, I went queen d3, trying to blockade the d4 pawn, recognizing that e5 was dropping, but just trying to hold up the d-pawn. Black now took on e5 with the bishop. I think that is very, very smart. Again, not rushing to trade the heavy pieces that might, expose his king if he doesn't need to. And, just intelligent decision-making. I now played rook fe1, trying to get a last-ditch pin pin on the e file and kind of make it uncomfortable for black to coordinate. But now black just went rook d6, and you could see all of the black forces are well protected in the center, so there's actually no counterplay here. Note that if I go for queen c4, which does paralyze the bishop on e5 temporarily because e6 would be hanging, black can now push d3. And this actually becomes a huge problem. Now, not right away, because if d3 right away, rook takes e5, picks up a piece because of this pin. But black can play king g7, and then d3 becomes a serious threat. So the issue is that I can't actually maintain the pressure on e6 because I was actually trying to blockade the d-pawn. So, yeah, problems abound. After rook d6, I decided to play a5, trying to, maybe get some counterplay with my own, passed pawns, but it's just too slow. And black now goes king g7, stepping out of any checks on this diagonal. Very, very smart decision. Note that the dark squares on this diagonal are very secure as long as the bishop and the pawn are, centralized here. And now I have very limited counterplay. So I played b4, trying to kind of shove my pawns up the board. And now black went bishop f6. And now you can actually see he's actually just ready for trades because he's pretty much ready to trade the pieces, get the queen in, and then, queen the d-pawn. And it's very, very difficult to stop. I played g3 now, trying to at least secure another square for my king. But this is actually kind of a poor move because now my king is completely exposed on the second rank, and I completely weaken this diagonal. Instead, I am losing, but it probably would have been better to fight on with the move, with the move b5, and just try to push these passed pawns forward. But I wasn't really buying it after a move like rook takes e4, rook takes e4, and I don't know, maybe even like a move like rook e6. There's just too many threats based upon my dark squares being so weak. For instance, if I take on e6 after queen takes an a6, queen e1 check is already a problem because after king h2, there's bishop e5. And again, the dark squares are just too weak to really even hope to have a chance in this game because I have to go g3 here. And now queen f2 check is probably decisive. Note that after king h1, my king can't even move, and black would merely have to play bishop takes g3 and then queen h2 mate, but would probably start with a bit of prophylaxis like king h6 just to step out of any checks before taking. And yeah, again, I'm not close to queening. After a7, bishop g3. I don't know, maybe I'm kind of close. I can sack the queen here, but I don't know, I just wasn't buying it. These lines are not totally perfect, and black is just faster. I knew that. But g3 was a very poor move that kind of just weakened my king side and doesn't actually solve anything. So, yeah, so after g3, rook e4 is played, and after rook takes, queen b7 was played, and this was actually a move, again, I completely missed. And it's actually a very obvious double attack, because now, not only is b4 hanging, because after b4 drops, a5 will drop soon thereafter, but also the rook on e4 is pinned, and now rook e6 is a serious threat, just picking up a rook. So this pin is actually totally decisive, and totally born out of the fact that I played g2 to g3, which was just horrible decision-making. After queen b7, I went king g2 because I recognize now I have to try and bring my king up to support the rook on e4. In a dream scenario, I could hope for rook e6, king f3, a trading everything, and then, maybe queening my pawn. But, of course, black is not going to, willingly trade like this. I mean, it's just not logical. But this would be a way I could potentially win the game. Like, if a6 is a serious threat, and if bishop e7, now b5, and my connected passed pawns would be decisive here. But totally, totally unnecessary, and not a line that, black would seriously have to entertain if he's smart. So, yeah. So anyways, instead, after king g2, at rook e6, king f3, black just played rook c6. And here I realized just how perilous my position was, because rook c3 is a major threat picking off the queen, and my king really has no way to, escape. Note that if I go king e2, queen takes b4 can be played, and my king is just completely naked, and I'm going to get overrun immediately by checks and get mated. And if I, run up to g4, well, then queen d7 check is a huge problem, and I can't go back because of rook c3. And if I step up, the king will get mated here very quickly with a move like queen h3. So actually, after the move rook c6, I actually resigned. And very, very disappointing game. What can I say? I lost to someone that was rated 2100 FIDE, and definitely more talented than 2100. I mean, he was a FIDE master. I think he got it from a World Youth event, so he never actually got to 2300 FIDE yet. But definitely a talented player, has a lot of room for improvement, will get better and be. It's just a good junior, pretty underrated. But also, the things that I missed, the ideas in this game, I routinely missed. Queen b7, things in the opening, knight e5, f6. I missed a lot of important details and was simply not myself. And in fact, after this game, I actually withdrew from the World Open. 5 rounds into the tournament, I withdrew from the event because I felt so physically ill that I was unable to continue. And I'm a competitor. I'm someone that tries to fight it out through everything. Even when things are going poorly chess-wise, I just think, something's going to turn around. Just play the next game. Just keep fighting. But my stomach was in such a bad way that I was not actually physically in a position to continue. And I thought the best thing to do would actually be to leave Philadelphia altogether and go back to New York and see some doctors. And that's actually what I did. So this game in round 5 was actually the last game I played in this 9-round tournament because I felt so ill, and my chess was certainly showing. So very disappointing end to the tournament. It is what it is. I definitely lost about 10 or so rating points from this one. And it was just a disappointing way to play chess, but I think I was kind of fighting my stomach the whole year, and I thought, you know what, I can kind of deal with it, but sometimes you can't, fight your body. You have to really listen to it, respect it. You only have one vessel, and, it's important to trust that and respect it and love it and, treat it with care and all that, and I made the right decision for my body, so that's what I did. So anyways, I was back into chess. I was back in action, not too soon after this tournament. So it is what it is, but it was a smart thing to withdraw this one. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.